folks, thank you so much for your patience. I just want to welcome everybody. Thank you for your time this afternoon. My name is David M. I'm the Vice President of Business Development here at Archetype Consulting. First of all, thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedules and your busy day to attend our webinar on the topic of driving sustainable cost reduction. We've received an overwhelming response and interest to this topic, evidenced by the multitude and overwhelming attendance that we have today here from a multitude of finance professionals from various industry sectors and verticals. Here are some things that we'll cover today, obviously, with the topic. We're going to cover main points of driving sustainable cost reduction. You'll also hear various case studies from a pharma organization that added, a $25 billion pharma organization that added over $500 million to their bottom line, and various other case studies. Here's some rules of engagement. During our presentation, if at any time, if you have any questions that arise, please send them to me, to either myself or Dean Sorensen, the organizer presenter, via chat, and we will cover those questions during our question and answer session. Also, I wanted to make you aware of the raise hand feature in the control panel of the GoToMeeting panel. During the presentation, there's going to be some questions that we're going to be asking of the audience to keep things a little bit more interactive, and also our goal is to always learn a little bit more about our customers and our colleagues out there in the field. So please don't be shy and participate and raise your hand. We'd love to get that type of feedback from you. And without further ado, well, actually one other, if you would like to get a recorded copy of this presentation or receive future updates or schedules of our future presentations, please reach out to me. I will have my email on the chat screen here shortly. And without further ado, let me present to you Dean Sorensen, our presenter. Dean Sorensen is currently the Director of Archetype's Finance Supply Chain Effectiveness Practice. He has over 30 years of public accounting and consulting experience. And prior to Archetype, he's held senior positions with KPMG, Accenture, and A.T. Kearney. He has a deep manufacturing experience. He's worked with more than 50 global manufacturers in all functions. He's personally led or participated in dozens of projects involving ERP, EPM, business process reengineering, strategic planning, balanced scorecard, and more. But his real main area of expertise is in the area of integrated business planning process and technologies, the applications to rolling forecasts and sales and operations planning processes. He speaks and writes frequently on this topic. He's authored a whole bunch of white papers, one specifically called the 10-Day Plan that describes how manufacturers can reduce planning and budgeting cycles to 10 days. And without further ado, we have Dean Sorensen.
Thanks, David, for that kind introduction. Before getting too deep into this, I just want to give you a little bit of background about Archetype and to give you some perspective about what you're going to hear today. One of the things about Archetype is that we help organizations improve all aspects of their management processes. And that's not a term that a lot of organizations use, but one of the things that we're starting to find is that a lot of the challenges that our organizations are facing, especially complex ones, are really driven by the fact that they have fragmented management processes. And this whole issue of rolling forecasts is really starting to raise that issue, so that, you know, as organizations are trying to make that process work, I think what they're starting to see is that greater integration is required, and you know, it's a topic that I think is growing in interest. So, with that in mind, I'll just give you some key messages that we're going to try and get across today. And you know, as I'm going through this, one thing I'll let you know that when I have something on the screen. I'm going to assume that you can read faster than I can speak, so I'm not going to cover everything on the screen. But the main questions that we're going to cover are the ones shown on the left side of the screen there. And the key ideas behind those questions are shown on the right. So I think the main things that we're really going to talk about is what do we mean by a fully integrated rolling forecast process? What specific capabilities support it, and how does it really create value? So we're going to have some specific case studies on that. So with that in mind, let me just quickly go over the agenda. So we're going to spend the first 10 minutes just quickly getting through our perception of the current state. Not going to go into gory amounts of detail, but just paint a picture for you as to how we see the world. I'll then take 5 minutes to really talk about what we call integrated business planning and define what we mean by that. So it answers the question, what do you really get from integration that we don't really have now? Then we'll talk about driver-based planning maturity. I think a lot of organizations have heard the term driver-based planning, but there's many different forms of it, and we're going to give you a framework for looking at those different types of maturity levels. Then we're going to get into some case studies that speak to how integrated business planning and integrated rolling forecasts can create value. And then we'll get into integrated rolling forecasts and supply chain or sustainable cost reduction strategy. And then we'll leave some time at the end for some questions. So that's how we see using our time. So we've lost a couple minutes. I'll try and make up for that. So very quickly, the first thing I want to raise is, why are we talking about rolling forecasts? And it really seems like this has really become an issue in the last couple of years. I think at first, this whole, we've heard of the beyond budgeting movement. There was actually a book written on it. There's increasing dissatisfaction with budgeting as a management tool. And I think that was really highlighted in the recent economic conditions where I think a lot of organizations found that their budgets weren't terribly useful. And what complicates that is the fact that a lot of more organizations are becoming global and finding that what they're currently using isn't really helping. And then, of course, there's a finance wanting to be a more effective function within the organization. So those are the main things that we see driving the interest in this topic. Now, the theory behind rolling forecasts is pretty simple, and you can see the things on the screen there. Basically, a lot of organizations talk about having not just a static forecast, but something that rolls every month over an 18 to 24-month horizon. Some believe it should replace fixed budgets, but if you look at the bottom, this is a Dilbert cartoon that, in my mind, really kind of captured the essence of the conundrum that organizations are facing. They see this rolling forecast as an interesting tool, but their forecasting processes are inaccurate. So how do you reconcile that paradox? So this is what we really see as this rolling forecast gap, and the gap really depends on the level of complexity of the organization. So on the left-hand side, you see company A. The tools that they're currently using are meeting close to 100% of their needs and capturing a good portion of the value. So therefore, their forecast accuracy is high and their speeds are pretty good. But when you get down to the other end, big complex companies are feeling something different. And I think the question that they're asking is that we now have planning processes that may be at 80 or 90 day annual planning process at 80 or 90 days. Our forecasts aren't that accurate. So, the challenge that we have is that we know that we need to be less than 30 if we want them to roll. So, maybe down to 20 days. And, of course, we have to improve the accuracy. So the question that they're asking is, like, what specific capabilities are going to allow us to simultaneously improve those things? And many of these companies are ones that have already invested in EPM and, various other tools. And, they're sitting there looking at closing that gap. So before I go too much further, David, we were going to have a quick poll and ask people how many people are resonate with that particular problem. Is that something that that you're feeling? So perhaps you can get some responses from that raise hand feature.
So everybody, I apologize. We're actually experiencing a little bit of technical difficulties. There is the raise hand feature is for some reason not showing up on this platform right now. Dean, I just wanted to make you aware of that, and we'll move on. Yep.
Okay. All right. All right. Well, let me just quickly talk about what we see the problem as being. You know, from a finance perspective, what they're seeing is that they lack visibility into operational capabilities and key constraints. So that's one of the reasons why forecasts are being missed, and operations is experiencing adverse results. And the primary reason for that is that the organizations are employing fragmented and overly simplistic models. That's ultimately the challenge when you get into more complex organizations that we find. And we see a lot of evidence of this. So on the left-hand side, you see a study from Duke University looking at the 5 major concerns of CFOs, and you know the 1, 2, and 5 are very closely interconnected, with forecasts being you know, number 2. Ability to maintain margins is obviously closely connected to sustainable cost reduction. So, you know, I think the things that what we're focusing on is very relevant. And, you know, on the right-hand side, I have a couple other research studies, but, you know, there's a whole bunch of them that really point to the fact that forecasting is problematic for many companies. And on the other side, from a cost reduction perspective, there's some very interesting studies that I've run across. So one of the ones that really is a very interesting one was one done by the conference board that said 90% of companies fail to sustain cost reductions for more than 3 years. And the one below that really was one done by A.T. Kearney that talked about the cost of complexity being as much as 2 to 5% of sales. So these are some pretty interesting research studies and fairly consistent with some of my experiences. And another one done by Booz Allen was showing at the bottom, and just the complication of trying to reduce costs when objectives are constantly changing in unstable economic conditions. So these things are very closely interrelated. So I think that the things that organizations are really struggling with in terms of how to reduce costs and improve forecasting are 5 things. You see the things on the left-hand side, which the first one is quantifying resources to support revenue KPI targets. And that leads to the wrong cuts and often leads to cost creeping back into the organization. And ultimately, what the question is that organizations can't really answer is, you know, how many people do we really need? I mean, because that's really the thing that that many organizations struggle with, and especially as they're going through cost-cutting exercise, they just don't have a good handle on where they can cut. Another thing is looking at the impact of service levels on costs. They don't see that interconnection, and then also quantifying the impact of decisions on organization performance. So making decisions based on models that don't provide the complete picture. So I think some of the other ones you probably read already, but I think there's a very close interrelation between forecasting and cost reduction. Now, one of the things I've found in past, I don't know if any of you know what activity-based costing is, but essentially it's a method that, you know, if you had everybody in your company tracking what they did every minute of the day in terms of what processes, products, and customers that they were working on, it would give you a pretty good picture of what profitability was, and that's what activity-based costing tries to show. And what I've experienced is what I've seen on the screen here is that, you know, you typically go in, you find a lot of products and customers, or a small number of products and customers account for the vast majority of profits, and a lot of them, the rest are losing. And these are the result of, you know, past decisions. Like, we'll go in and do that kind of work and identify these things that have transpired. And I think what we're really talking about is how do you prevent that from happening in the first place? So while activity-based costing is really good, provides some good insights, I think what organizations are really looking for is preventing these things from happening in the first place. And really the issue is complexity. So, you know, as more and more organizations, you see the complexity factors on the left-hand side, it's the ability to really manage outcomes across different vertical silos, if you will. And I think one of the challenges that organizations have is most of the strategies that they're pursuing are all horizontally based, yet the way that they plan to manage their business is still very vertically based. And that creates what we call an alignment paradox. But ultimately, solving that alignment paradox is really the basis for what we call sustainable cost reduction. And the three things that we show on the screen are what we mean by sustainable cost reduction. So strategy and cost structures, self-adjusting to changing market conditions and to achieve target margins. And you probably read the other ones, free flow of resources and specific translation of targets into resources. Those are the kind of the three basics of sustainable cost reduction that we see an integrated rolling forecast supporting. So that was a quick overview of what we see as kind of like the current state. What I'd like to do now is talk about what's new that can address these problems. So what I want to talk about is integrated business planning, and I think a lot of people talk about integrated business planning, but I'd like to get pretty specific about what we mean by it, what incremental capabilities do you get from it. So at the center of integrated business planning is a model, and these models do four things that we want to talk about. So these are really at its core, what is it, they answer the question, what are you bringing that really allows you to have a faster and more accurate process? So the first one is integrated scenarios and risks, where you take all the planning inputs on the left and look at it and translate those and all the planning outputs on the right. So you're literally integrating virtually every aspect of planning in an organization. So you're taking volume and KPI targets, translating that into traditional financial plans, forward-looking activity-based profitability, inventory and working capital, both from a physical perspective and from a financial perspective, and just a whole bunch of other things in there. So really just kind of linking every aspect of the business. And the big part about that is to really, as you're doing all of those things, the thing that I think is really captures a lot of that is what I call capacity-constrained cash flow forecasting. So cash flow forecasting is probably one of the most difficult things to do in most organizations. And the ability to do that while also understanding how cash flow is impacted by changes in volume and mix and the impact on available capacities. That is one of the big things I think that really drives integrated business planning. And that gives you what the result of that is what I call executable plans and optimized plans. So the second thing that's new is what I call distributed models. I think in a lot of organizations, the models that are being used are usually held by either a finance function or operations function, but they're really not distributed in a way where different people can own different parts of the model. And I think it does two things: slows down the process, and not only that, you're not always getting the most accurate models. So distributed models is a second major thing. And from that, at the end of the day, I think a model is going to be really accurate from the manager's perspective if it can accurately predict how many people do I need and where am I going to have capacity constraints. So being able to show something like we have on the right-hand side, while also helping to communicate where targets are overly aggressive, as I've shown on the left-hand side by the circle in the top left-hand corner. So just being able to identify those sorts of risks and while enabling them to manage their functions better. The third thing is what I call concurrent planning. So I think in most organizations, planning processes are very sequential. And what's new is the ability to take all of those sequential processes and roll them up into a concurrent planning process. And I'll get into that a little bit more in a few slides, but just wanted to introduce the idea. But the thing that's really driving that concurrency is, in fact, the model. And the last thing is what I call cross-functional coordination. So when somebody says to me, what does integration really look like if you painted a picture of it, this is what I usually show on the right-hand side. So being able to manage a cost per outcome and show it changing over time, both looking at history and from a forward-looking basis, and able to show how the changes in costs are also driving, or the changes in the process are driving both costs and key performance indicators such as perfect order fulfillment and days and receivables. And this is an order fulfillment process. So this is really what I call like a really well integrated forecasting and performance management function that would provide this kind of output. So what we just did there was define what we mean by integrated business planning. What I'd like to do now is just walk through the models that drive that kind of maturity of those four things. So let's quickly get into this. One of the things that we have is we use a maturity model, and we have five-level model, and I'll get into it in a little bit more detail in a bit. But the blue boxes really represent what we see as sort of different types of models. So at the very left-hand side, a lot of organizations are using percentages and basic simple unit times rate times type models. You may get into one in the next level which incorporate balance sheet and cash flow. In the middle, some get a little bit more sophisticated where they incorporate bills of materials. Level 4 is where I call work and activity based, where applications and tools integrate S&OP and financial planning, and then the ones that we're going to be talking about do all that, plus they're flow-based, and I really want to talk about what these flow-based models really enable organizations to do. And in the middle, this is really what I talk about, shows both the gap of where organizations are currently at and this convergence between supply chain planning and working capital cash flow forecasting. So let's just get into it. So what you see on the screen is a model of basically a process-based model of how organizations, or high-level model of how organizations might work, which basically connects outputs to inputs. And I think in some cases this may seem a little scary to finance people, but in the end, driver-based models really are just a financial representation of operations, and some are just more sophisticated than others. But let me just use this as a starting point. And the way these models, and there's different ones out there that do this type of thing, but essentially what the first thing they do is take customer demand and translate that into a supply chain or a supply plan. And then based on that supply plan, turn that into an operational plan, which then apply financial terms to develop a financial plan. And what comes out of that is a P&L balance sheet and a cash flow. So that's the basic construct of a flow-based model. So what I want to talk about is what is it these models give you that you don't get from other models. And the first one is what I would call dynamic drivers. So anybody that works in manufacturing or supply chain really knows the implications of changes in mix and volume. It can really be a very substantial thing. So what I'm showing here is on the left-hand side, if you have a certain volume mix, that may translate into a mix in the production processes, as I've shown. But if you change the upfront mix, you may have a different mix downstream. Most financial modeling systems do not have that kind of capability to understand mix and really provide an accurate view of the business. Second thing which is different is what I call time phase models. So being able to change the flow of the model, the throughput rates, resource requirements, or any other aspect of the model in any sort of time period, because now that's really important where you're constantly introducing either new products or new processes or making changes to those processes that may have a material impact on cash flow or any financial part of the business. The third thing is what I call process and segment cash flow. So the ability to actually track costs or forecast costs and cash by flow, and there could be literally thousands of these things, as you start connecting them all. And the way this thing does it, or these tools do it, is by essentially simulating the flow and essentially creating journal entries. So what it's really doing is just not only forecasting the P&L, but it's actually forecasting balance sheet cash flow, and it gets very specific. And these flows can, depending on a vendor or a specific flow, these flows can really change from one to another. And of course, if you have any capacity constraints, if you run into a capacity constraint that is shown in yellow, it knows what that means from a cash flow perspective. So very, very sophisticated in terms of being able to flow these things. I think the other thing which is actually very interesting as well from a supply chain perspective is the ability to include a bill of material in these flows. I think, in some cases, like companies doing some sales and operations planning, that may not be a big revelation, but I think the big challenge, I think, for a lot of companies in S&OP is to be able to really do it at an enterprise level and understand how different decisions impact costs and cash flow, because I think that's the missing piece in a lot of S&OP processes, especially ones that are really trying to support more effective decision making, because at the end of the day, when you get into an executive S&OP process, what organizations are really looking to decide is, and answer questions around is, how's this going to impact my cash? What's it going to do to my ability to achieve our target margins, and how's this going to affect the ROI of my project portfolio? So those questions are very difficult to answer without the ability to forecast cash. So those are kind of like the 5 things that I really talk about, and those are the key differences in terms of what I look at as in terms of a model. But what I'm showing on this page is really the convergence between sales and operations planning and financial planning. So I think a lot of companies start off with spreadsheets, then they automate them with, in financial terms, it would be simple drivers and then operations-based S&OP. Then in the third level, there are a lot more operational drivers, potentially bills and materials in there, and then financially driven S&OP from an S&OP perspective, all leading towards integrated planning. And at the other end, what we see is not just an integrated rolling forecast, but a model really that supports connected decision making and strategic planning. So like a centralized model that organizations use to make the most complex of decisions. Because one thing that we find is that especially in FP&A functions, that a lot of the more sophisticated models on key decisions, they end up recreating a lot of these models, and we believe that these centralized models can support more effective decision making. So this again is reintroducing the different types of models that exist at each of those different levels of maturity. So the key takeaway from this is that when people tell you that they have a fully integrated planning system or rolling forecast or it's driver-based planning, there's different levels of maturity of each one of those things, and you need to be if you're looking to develop a rolling forecast process, you need to be pretty specific in terms of what you're looking for and what you're asking for. So what I'd like to do now is just talk about a few case studies and really to drive home some of these points. And the ones that we'll talk about, the first 3 are really ones that reflect what happens when you don't use integrated business planning. And these are cases that I personally worked on, as well as some of the other ones at the end. These things are ones where they've used integrated business planning and realized a fairly significant amount of value. So we'll just walk through each one of these things. So the first one is a company that I worked with a few years ago. They had a fairly significant event where partway through the year there was a big disruption in the business, and we were brought in to help them figure out what the answer to, or what the underlying cause was. And there were a number of them, but the one that was actually the most revealing was the fact that in their supply chain function, they were understaffed by a factor of almost 40 to 50%. And the reason for that was that there had been a number of changes in the business. So, 10 years ago, when the organization sold a textbook to a school, they just sold a single textbook. And fast forward 10 years, you're selling a different one to different states. So it just added a lot more complexity, and you're selling a number of things to go along with that book, like teacher's aids and those sorts of things. And those things were just being not handled really well, to the point where the organization really didn't have the wherewithal to cope with that complexity, and the organization just really didn't see it. So what ended up happening was that they, because of this event, they ended up having, they lost sales somewhere in the neighborhood of $15 million. They ended up having to scrap a number of books that they had printed, and was a fairly significant event. But the takeaway from this was this is totally avoidable. They just really didn't have the wherewithal to see this thing coming, and really just points to the fact that there was just a real lack of integration between the financial and operational planning. So that was an interesting case study. Another one was a company I worked with, was an IT outsourcing company, and what they were experiencing was a degradation in their profitability. And what we ended up doing is developing a model that helped them see what was really happening. So I'll just quickly go to this. What was happening is that they were managing the business using traditional terminology shown on the bottom. And what we did was we turned it around and said, you really need to be thinking about this from a different perspective. Think about it from the customer's perspective. Really all they want to do is have an employee that's got access to all the various applications, and they have a working computer. But what we showed them, there were cost differentials of somewhere between $200 to $3,000 a user, and it was that sort of magnitude sort of difference. And what was happening was that they didn't see the changes in the mix of users, so they just didn't really see it coming at them. And again, this was a totally avoidable thing had they been able to link finance and operations to see these changes coming. This is another company I worked on. They're a manufacturer of recreational vehicles, and one of the things that was happening was that they were building more and more sophisticated machines to meet customer demand, and of course they were introducing a lot of ancillary products, that kind of thing. But what they didn't realize was that they were actually thinking that these products were very highly profitable based on the cost system that they had. But we ended up showing them that they were actually losing money on a lot of these things, and to the tune of somewhere in the tune of about $50 million that they were losing. We were able to identify some short-term improvements that yielded about $10 million, but there were still a number of things that required a substantial amount of effort to fix. Again, this is a completely avoidable situation if organizations really had the tools to see these interrelationships, but this was a fairly sizable company. They didn't see it coming at them. But the other thing I wanted to point out here is that while we pointed out a number of these costs, when I call back, I'll often call back to companies after a few years and find out how things are going. A lot of these costs had actually crept back into the system. So, when I see these surveys that say organizations don't sustain cost reductions for more than 3 years, it's very consistent with some of my findings with some of my clients. Now, let's just look at some of the things that organizations have used integrated business planning for. So here's one company based in Europe. They were looking to structure their supply chain in a way that actually reduced costs, and that was their initial focus. But actually, when you incorporate finance and start looking at with value-added tax and all the tax ramifications, you ended up getting an entirely different point of view as to what the lowest cash cost of the supply chain was. And I think the big thing that was that we're able to use these models for, you could model the flow of the goods and services physically, you know, how inventory was going to be moving and the timing of the inventory, and then map the financial flows to that. And there were a number of different variables that were moving simultaneously that made this make it difficult to do this on a spreadsheet. So in this particular case, the benefit for them a year was upwards of about $140 million over and above what they thought the lowest total cost of the supply chain was. So a very interesting application of, you know, financial and operational integration. Here's another company. This is a global manufacturer of a high-tech manufacturer, and one of the things that the challenges that they have is in high tech. You know, a lot of these products, you know, they're out on in the market for potentially less than 6 months or less, and what they want to be able to do is hit a narrow window where they can bring a new product to market and capture the potential upside without without killing themselves with inventory. And doing this across, you know, umpteen number of countries was incredibly complicated. Not only did you want to look at this from an operational perspective, but you want to look at, you know, are we optimizing sales? Are we optimizing costs as well? So using a model such as this one, the organization was able to find opportunities where they could actually place bets. And that's the way they looked at it, just bets on where the upside sales were, and be able to capture those upside sales with a minimal investment in some of these inventory items, specifically looking at ones that weren't huge cost items. So this was really a more cross-functional, cross-entity approach to doing sales and operations planning, and this sales and operations planning process was actually based on cash. And the last one is probably a pretty compelling one as well. This is for a pharmaceutical company where they actually integrated the sales and operations planning process with a product launch process, and really incorporated both the operational and financial flows. So in a pharmaceutical business, you're really looking at very uncertain demand, a lot of upfront costs, and trying to manage that across shared resources gets terribly complicated. So over the course of the time it takes to launch the product, these positions can change quite a bit. What ends up happening is a lot of companies, because they don't have a holistic view, they overcompensate for the risk, and that's what happened in this particular case. So by looking at the product or the process more holistically, they were able to avoid $300 million in supplier investment and $200 million of inventory that wasn't built. So this was really a cash preservation play. So I think that classic example of how these tools create value. And so other places where, or other value sources, are the ones shown in the middle, and there's other ones shown around in these circles. And I think that all of these case studies really show benefits in excess of $100 million. And all of these were, the common theme across all these things were very complex supply chains and complex decisions. So that is a quick overview of the value. So what I'd like to do is really talk about the various like in this, what sorts of things ought you to be considering when you're thinking about investment and assessment. There's 6 things that we wanted to address. The first was complexity. So if you're a company that's really complex, and we talked about this alignment paradox before, if you have those sorts of complexity factors, and you're seeking to achieve the business objectives on the left-hand side, and you may or may not be achieving the full value out of ERP and other sorts of big initiatives, it may be a sign that you may want to consider something a little bit more sophisticated. These unwritten rules, I find in a lot of organizations, when I walk in, it really kind of gives me a good sign as to how effective their planning, budgeting, and forecasting processes are. And I think that, I walk into a lot of companies and, these are very, very prevalent. And it really is indicative of a couple of things, like a planning and performance management process that really is not working all that well, and couple that with some misaligned rewards and incentives. So they're really very telling things, and it's really difficult to address these things without fixing the process first. Again, some of the objectives, if you're seeking to achieve some of the objectives that I show on the screen here in these sorts of complex environments, especially one where those unwritten rules exist, it becomes very difficult to achieve these objectives without looking at taking a more holistic approach and having more sophisticated tools. And also, I tend to look at where there's a number of connected stakeholder issues. So, for example, supply chain organizations often lack a lot of visibility across the supply chain, especially when there's a lot of dotted line relationships. So being able to influence those costs or influence the performance becomes very, very complex. A whole host of other things that organizations are really trying to do. CIOs, for example, one of the things that they're trying to do is optimize the value of technology investments and process performance. Very difficult to do without having a management system that really supports it. So, as well, if you're looking at, or you have a number of management process initiatives or anything that kind of fits on this screen, it would almost behoove you to kind of step back and have a look at how do you think all these things are really going to create value, and what level of sophistication do you really need to have? Because at the end of the day, the thing that organizations tend to miss, when they're looking at these initiatives, is that it's the models that's really driving the value, especially in complex organizations. So you really have to first select an application that delivers the models first and then wraps everything else around it. Now, this is I didn't want to get into a lot of detail on this one. This is our view of an integrated rolling forecast process. This really is a presentation in and of itself. We can take it offline and talk to you about how this might work, but I wanted to use this as a kind of a backdrop to talk to you about some leading practices in forecasting. So these are the things on the left-hand side that we see as really being the leading practices, really being able to execute these processes quickly in like 20 to 30 days, integrating forecasting with sales and operations planning, really being able to take a balanced scorecard and drive it into financial statements very quickly, highly accurate profit and cash flow statements. You can see the rest of them, but these are the things that we see as really being the leading practices that are really driven by the models that support integrated rolling forecasts. So the types of questions I think that a lot of organizations should be asking, I've kind of segregated them into two groups, and again, you can read them. But these are the things that we think that organizations should be thinking about in an assessment, and at least having a preliminary understanding and preliminary viewpoints about these different questions. And those sorts of things really comprise the thing that we our diagnostic that helps organizations think through this. And one of the things that we offer to clients is to come in for a day on our nickel and help them think through some of these things. So if you're at all interested, we'd be more than happy to come in and help you think through some of that. So quickly, in terms of key messages, these are some of the things that we got through. I think that when you're talking about a fully integrated rolling forecast, there's some specific capabilities that comprise it. I think when people talk about integration, it's not always really specific in terms of the capabilities. And I think the key takeaway here is that there are specific capabilities you ought to be looking for, and that as organizations become more complex, rolling forecasts and executive S&OP really become the same process. And given that, it might make sense to think about how they fit together at an earlier stage. And I think that these integrated rolling forecasts and these integrated capabilities really are the ones that are driving the accuracy and speed of those forecasts. And I think that what we've shown with the case studies that the value can be significant in complex organizations, and this, in some of the cases we showed as well, is that some short-term initiatives can drive big value as well and self-fund things. And an assessment can be a great place to start. So that, in a nutshell, is what we wanted to talk to you about with regards to integrated rolling forecasts and sort of the key ideas behind how do you use them to drive value. So let me turn it back over to Dave.
Yep. Dave, thank you very much for sharing those insights with us. Everyone, we're entering into our question and answer session, and thank you to those who submitted some questions during the presentation. If you do have a question that you would like to ask during this time, please type the word question and message it to me, and I will, from a process standpoint, unmute your mic, and you'll be able to ask your question. So right now is the time to ask your questions. I will give it about half a minute or so, and if there aren't any verbal questions now, we could address one of the questions that were sent earlier. Why don't we go ahead and address one of those questions while maybe people think about some questions that they wanted to ask. Dean, there was one question that came in during our presentation, and it was one of the earlier questions. One of our attendees asked, does integrated business planning replace EPM, or is there a role for both?
That's a really good question. Actually, I don't see integrated business planning replacing EPM. I see them as being very complementary. The only thing I think of is, before one goes to buy an EPM system, you should probably think about where you want to be in the long term and how they're going to fit together, because it'll influence, could influence which system that you pick. But I think I don't think you'll never find a situation where it'll replace it.
Okay. Thank you very much. If there are any other questions, please type the word question into the chat session. Until we have a question from the audience live, we'll continue to address some of the other questions that have came in. Integrated business process is discussed a lot as a next generation beyond sales and operations planning. How new is this topic of IBP? And you seem to be taking it a little bit further than others. What specific things do you see IBP process beyond what others are discussing?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to see a lot about integrated business planning from people in the supply chain. And they talk about it as sort of the next thing beyond S&OP. But I think that they tend to stop short of, really how it addresses the broader business need. So, for example, one of the things that I don't see talked about in a lot of discussions about integrated business planning is foreign exchange forecasting. So, if you have a global S&OP process, one of the fallouts of having such a process is the ability to simulate working capital. And I think a lot of treasurers are just flying blind, when it comes to looking at doing foreign exchange hedging, that, they just don't see how the movement of inventories, payables, and receivables. So they're, what they tend to do is be very, very conservative, both in terms of foreign exchange forecasting and in their cash positions. So I think that there's some, in many cases, there's a lot of immediate value that can be had from that. So, you can extend that into doing capital planning, that kind of thing. So I don't think that a lot of integrated business planning as it relates to S&OP factors those sorts of things in. So that's really a couple of examples of how I see that kind of broader IBP.
Okay. Thank you for that answer, Dean. Just to let everybody know, there's two more questions that are left that have been asked via chat. If you do have a question, please let us know. Next question is, is it possible to incorporate external market indicators that are relevant to our business?
That's a really good question, and I think that one of the things that's probably going to be something that we do in a subsequent webinar, it deserves a topic all by itself. But one of the things that one wants to be able to do, like nobody really knows, how the market's going to change. But one of the things that you do want to be able to do is take various scenarios in terms of how you see leading indicators affecting demand, and then driving that into a model that simultaneously looks at the impact on the entire business. So I think from that perspective, there's a lot to be leveraged from integrated business planning in terms of making really good use of market data, because like I say, the biggest thing you really want to be able to do is prepare for different scenarios in terms of how you think the market's going to react, and then how you're going to position yourself, or what strategies you're going to use to minimize the impact on potential downside scenarios.
Great. Thank you very much for that answer. The final question that was sent in earlier is, one second. So thank you for the presentation, a very interesting subject. What are the best ways to introduce this concept that you shared with us to my colleagues in my organization?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, this is a pretty new subject that crosses many different functions, and in many cases it's going to require some fairly significant changes in organizations, and those things don't happen overnight. I think the best way to introduce this into an organization, there's 2 points I want to make here. First, I think you got to figure out what problem is it going to solve for key stakeholders. I think that I addressed some of that before in one of my slides, but I think people are more apt to want to focus on something if it solves a problem for them. So, for example, I talked about treasury. How would this solve a problem for treasury in terms of doing cash flow and foreign exchange forecasting? So that's one. And the second thing, I think, is to show how it can demonstrate, how it can create value. So, starting off with a big monolithic project is probably not the way to go. I think that one of the things you want to be able to do is show how the capabilities such as this can really drive some value. And I showed some places, in one of those slides where there were specific issues that you could use to integrated business planning to create some value and address a specific pain point. So those are kind of 2 recommendations. Of course, as we said before, I think that one of the things that you should also do along with that is look at some sort of an assessment process to figure out where you're at and how people and what potential actions you could take.
Great. Thank you so much for that answer, Dean. That wraps up our Q&A session. If you do have any additional questions, you do see Dean's contact info on the screen. I have also posted my direct email on the chat window. If you would like a copy of the presentation, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll be more than happy to give you a direct recording of this presentation that was done today. And always feel free to reach out to us from an educational resource standpoint. We're always here to further the resources that are available on these forward-looking topics. Dean, any final thoughts?
No, just if anybody has any questions, like you said, Dave, to reach out to either myself or David. Also feel free to connect up with me on LinkedIn. I've got a blog there if you'd like to look at some of the comments I've made there. Anyway, we'll look forward to speaking to people in the future should you have a desire to connect on any issues.
Muted.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time today. And we will be reaching out to you with any future events and webinars that might be relevant to you and your organization. Thank you so much today, and have a great one, everybody.